Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on how to harness the WTO to improve the personal protective equipment supply chain. My name is Dmitry Grozobinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and it is my absolute privilege to welcome you to this session and to introduce our moderator. I will use the greeter's prerogative for just one thing, and that is to share how absolutely proud we at the Geneva Trade Platform are to have helped organize the G2 hackathon, which was really the first stone that rolled down the mountain and has led to this moment. The absolutely exceptional students and presenters you'll see today did all of the rest, but we knocked that first pebble over, and we're tremendously proud to have done that. So with absolutely no further ado than that, I'm going to ask my colleague Michael to bring up our moderator for today, Rashid Kokab. Rashid, welcome. The floor is yours, sir. Rashid, for those who by some chance have not encountered him yet, is the director of CUTS Geneva, and an absolute institution in town who has been very gracious to help us do this event today. Rashid, please.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Your very, very kind introduction made me blush. Of course, that would not be visible on virtuality has certain advantages. So you also helped me a lot. I don't need to say the formal welcome. You have done it very well. Let me just say that we are very privileged to have this session jointly organized by the Geneva Trade Platform, the Center for Trade and Economic Integration at the Graduate Institute, and CUTS International Geneva. Dmitry, you were also kind enough to give a very nice, in few words, like you always do, the essence of this session, and then how proud we all are at the efforts of these three young students. Let me say a few words before giving them the floor. It will be no exaggeration to say that the world has been a strange and particularly unpredictable place since the beginning of the last year. The endurance, the resilience of the humanity has been severely tested in these times. But also, this formidable challenge has spurred the minds and actions of many to understand and analyze the problems, to identify and elaborate solutions, and very importantly, to do better for the good of all. In my opinion, no matter how small or big, each effort counts. And I'm particularly heartened, as mentioned by Dmitry, also by the response of the young who have strived to meet the challenge with their youthful energy and the belief in a better future. And this event is an extremely good example of that, which is based on the research undertaken by three young and bright minds on this critical issue of personal protection equipment supply and the need for transparency in that. This has been and will be a key element of strategies to better face the pandemics. And what is even more heartening is that the effort of these three young students did not remain limited to researching the lack of transparency in the PPE market. They have boldly and thoughtfully gone ahead to propose a solution as well. In my opinion, a solution that is simple and doable, but of course, with the commitment of the political will and the commitment of adequate resources. I will be introducing the three of them shortly to invite them to make a presentation. Let me also tell you that the full research paper will be published shortly by the co-organizers of this session. I'm also very glad that we have two excellent discussants, Ambassador Anzen of Sweden to the WTO, as well as Professor Marceau, a respected legal expert. Based on this presentation and the discussions, our aim today is to advance the agenda for PPE market transparency through open and focused discussion. Let me also say that all of you, we welcome your participation. This being a webinar, it will not be possible to give you the mic or the floor, whatever we call it, but your questions and comments are very welcome. You can use the question and answer function as well as the chat function. by making sure that everyone is able to see your questions. With this, the presentation by the three of them, I would not interrupt that. So that's why I will introduce them right at the beginning, so that when I give the floor to first of them in the order, they can keep moving from one to the next. So we have these three very bright young minds, Kyle de Klerk, a South African master's student at the Graduate Institute. I imagine many of you would know him, as well as Mariana. He's doing masters in international affairs with specialization in trade and international finance. His interests include trade and development, international economic law, and the nexus between international trade policy and digital governance. And I'm very pleased that he interned with us during the summer. The other presenter co-author is Nadia Garcia, a public policy PhD candidate at Tecnológico de Monterrey School of Government and Public Transformation. For a year, she was also a visiting scholar recently at the Max Planck Institute for International European and Regulatory Procedural Law. Her research interests include international trade laws and institutions, trade policy negotiations, and trade disputes. Finally, the third author and speaker is Mariana Mendes. She's also a master's candidate of international affairs at the Graduate Institute, specializing in international trade and global health. And she has a more than 5 years of experience of working already in multinationals, doing international trade, as well as in the public sector by working at the Ministry of Health of Mexico. So as this brief introduction already demonstrates that these authors, presenters are young, but already have rich experience and insights. So the presentation will be, first, it will be Kyle who will start. He will be providing an analysis of the global PPE market, the impact of COVID-19 on that PPE production and supply, and the systemic lack of basic PPE supply chain information at all levels. After that, Nadia will elaborate the key technical, practical, and political elements of a proposed solution. That is the creation of an international PPE market supply transparency system. And finally, Mariana will make some concluding remarks. So with this slightly longer introduction that I had anticipated, my pleasure to invite the authors and the presenters to start their presentation, starting with Kyle, followed by Nadia, and then Mariana. Kyle.
Well, thank you very much, Rashid, and thank you to everyone who's joined to watch this presentation. So today, as Rashid's just mentioned, we'll be presenting a brief overview of some of the findings of an upcoming paper which proposes a means to enhance the supply chain transparency of PPE for future supply resilience and pandemic preparedness. As you can probably tell from my Zoom name, and as Rashid mentioned, I'm Kyle. I'll be starting off the presentation, and I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Nadia Garcia and Mariana Mendes, who, as Rashid mentioned, you'll hear from in due course. So the idea behind this paper was really conceived in April at a competition co-hosted by the Graduate Institute and the Geneva Trade Platform. But the paper itself, although it's taken a while for us to actually write it, couldn't have been released at a more opportune time. In a recent publication, the WTO's called for members to enhance supply transparency for goods to fight COVID-19. And from that publication, I quote, they recommend, to the extent possible, that members launch and facilitate public-private partnerships with relevant stakeholders in order to collect as much trade-related information as possible from multiple sources. This is particularly important for gathering production data and mapping supply chains for essential goods. For products that are manufactured by relatively few producers, and provided that adequate guarantees can be provided by governments in terms of confidentiality and other considerations, that members try to establish a mechanism by which private companies can voluntarily share relevant information. And thus, we hope that our presentation can be interpreted by all of you within this context and as a direct response to this recommendation by the WTO. But what exactly are we going to be presenting to you today? So this presentation will unfold in three parts. In the first part, I'll present some background information on the international PPE market and kind of explore a few ways what went wrong in the context of COVID-19 last year. Second, I'll discuss how a lack of information on PPE supply exacerbated the situation, and then argue that transparency is needed because of this for future crisis preparedness. Third, my colleague Nadia Garcia will present the substance of our proposal to enhance the transparency of the international PPE supply chain through the creation of what we have called the Market Supply Transparency System. And then last, but certainly not least, my other colleague, Mariana Mendez, will be presenting some closing remarks. So let's kick this presentation off by looking at some of the characteristics of the international PPE market prior and then during COVID. So it's important here, and as a bit of a disclaimer, to note that the opacity of the PPE supply chain is the very problem that we are looking to solve with our proposal. However, the same opacity means that there's a lack of availability of basic production data at all levels. And this makes it incredibly difficult to get an accurate picture of how PPE production is spread around the world and even within countries. However, it's still possible to get an impression through making informed estimates. And we believe that this impression is sufficient to understand just how concentrated PPE production is, yet simultaneously the extent to which the PPE market is globalized. So prior to COVID-19 in 2019, China produced around 60% of all PPE globally. The US was the second largest player in this market, producing around 20% of all PPE, excluding gloves, but gloves were the primary form of PPE and had about a 44% market share, of which 65% came from Malaysia. However, when COVID hit last year, this all changed fundamentally. Production boomed, as you can imagine. There was a huge increase in both domestic and international demand, and masks really came to be the primary PPE product that was produced and consumed around the world. And in this context, the impact of COVID on the international PPE market, there are three important points. The first is that India, which is the second most populous country in the world, did not really have any domestic PPE manufacturing capacity prior to COVID-19. However, when COVID hit, somehow India developed this capacity almost overnight, and in the space of a couple of weeks, increased domestic production capacity by 5,600%. And so it became the second largest producer of PPE in the world, but almost all of the PPE that it produces was used and still is used to satisfy domestic demand. And so although it's the second largest producer, it's not really a major player in the international market. Second, many parallel production lines switched to producing PPE. Textile production lines in Bangladesh and Vietnam and automakers in the USA all switched to producing different PPE products. However, a perceived low longevity of demand dissuaded long-term investment in many fledgling production industries. And the inability for these fledgling industries to compete with Chinese imports has meant that where domestic PPE manufacturing capacity did develop, this was largely temporary and is being scaled down as we speak right now. Last, and most significantly for our presentation, China's increase in production capacity, coupled with this lack of growth in other domestic manufacturing industries around the world, means that now China accounts for more than 80% of global PPE supply. And thus, the impact of COVID has been to actually concentrate as opposed to diversify PPE production. So given that production is so concentrated in China, it's clear that trade plays an integral role in ensuring that countries around the world have sufficient PPE. In 2020, trade was worth about $90.5 billion, and this is a 433% increase from the amount of PPE traded in 2019. Unsurprisingly, given its dominance in production, China is also the largest trader of PPE. It's the dominant exporter across all PPE products, especially within masks, which now account for more than 70% of the value of all traded PPE. However, and most crucially, trade statistics are not actually a sufficient measure of production and consumption patterns, as evidenced by the case of India. Due to a lack of transparency regarding production, it's unclear what share of each country's domestic demand for PPE is met through domestic supply or through imports. And thus, it's unclear to what extent countries are dependent on trade to satisfy domestic PPE demand. So coming to price, as we all know, PPE prices skyrocketed in 2020 due to a perfect storm of conditions. On the demand side, demand increased by around 300 to 400%, particularly for masks, which became 40% of PPE consumed in 2020 versus 5% in 2019. On the supply side, and what we will be focusing on, while production increased substantially, it still wasn't able to sate the spike in demand. And this is because COVID exerted three types of supply constraints. The first is that lockdown policies reduced the availability of labor, inputs, and transport for finished products, which undermined production efficiency. The second is that major shipping bottlenecks arose caused by the closure of ports and the grounding of passenger flights. And this had a huge impact on the price of shipping, not just for PPE, but for all goods. Prior to COVID-19, it cost 35 US cents to ship a mask, or per mask. And in April 2020, this had increased from 35 cents to $2.50, an over 700% increase in price in the space of a couple of months. Most significantly, and third, 47 countries, including the major PPE producers such as China and the US, implemented export restrictions on PPE in 2020. In the case of China, what it did is it tightened export licensing requirements and procured the majority of export-bound PPE to satisfy domestic demand at the onset of the pandemic. So given this lack of production diversification and the dependence on imports for PPE provision, these supply constraints meant that hospitals in many countries around the world faced a 3 to 6 month delay in getting much needed PPE, even by the end of 2020. Also, unsurprisingly, this caused prices to skyrocket. This graph here shows the prices that UNICEF was paying to buy PPE on international markets in 2020 compared to before the pandemic. What we can clearly see from this graph is that masks were the most affected, both face masks and N95 masks. So now I'll move on to examine just how a lack of transparency on the supply side really contributed to the market volatility, which I've just discussed. So far, this presentation has hopefully showed you all how globalized the supply chain of PPE is and how much of a role trade plays in ensuring countries in the world have access to PPE. But the crucial thing to note is the globalized nature of the supply chain was not known to policymakers before the pandemic struck. Policymakers in many countries didn't even have access to basic data, such as the share of their domestic demand met through imports versus through domestic production. And so what this meant is that policymakers and healthcare professionals were unaware just how concentrated global PPE production was, and thus how dependent their access to PPE was on the domestic politics and demand status in other countries. Ultimately, and unaware of the extent to which the PPE supply chain is highly vulnerable to vulnerable shocks. While this lack of transparency was a contributory factor to domestic shortages and huge price spikes, it also continued to plague policymakers throughout the pandemic, who implemented hasty, uninformed, and uncoordinated policy actions, such as export restrictions. Export restrictions are obviously counterproductive in a context of hyper-globalized markets, and thus just exacerbated PPE market instability. Therefore, ensuring transparency is a market-enhancing mechanism and a global public good in the context of essential goods such as PPE. Ultimately, transparency is a prerequisite for all economic actors and policymakers alike to make informed, efficient, and thus effective decisions in ensuring that those most in need have timely access to PPE in times of crisis. On this slide here, as the Asian Development Bank states, transparent and comprehensive information about the availability of products on the market, production capacity, and supply response is critical for PPE readiness during these outbreaks, epidemics, and even more so for pandemics. An efficient, low-burden mechanism for governments and private sector partners to share situational and supply information needs to be developed. So to this end, I will hand over to my colleague Nadia Garcia, who will present the substance of our proposal to enhance supply-side transparency for PPE.
Thank you, Kyle. As my colleague Kyle has stressed throughout this presentation, one of the most critical hindrances when designing policy responses to tackle a crisis is the lack of timely and updated information. To remedy these weaknesses, we propose the creation of the Market Supply Transparency System, a secure, public, digital system that aggregates real-time PPE market supply data from manufacturers, distributors, and governments in a confidential manner. The technology behind the MSTS is multi-party homomorphic encryption, which is already in use in a similar way by systems such as Medco, which operates as Swiss hospitals. This technology relies on mathematically proven guarantees for data confidentiality, making it possible to analyze data from different parties without any party accessing each other's information, because computations are performed on encrypted data. This means that the MSTS would not be able to see the data, but would be able to aggregate it and produce an encrypted output that only parties with the key would be able to see. However, to collect the necessary information to operate the system, it is essential to have the government's commitment to instruct relevant public and private agents to collaborate on the generation of timely and accurate data on PPE supply. In this sense, while transparency provisions are common in trade agreements, they proved insufficient to address the need for PPE supply data during COVID-19. For this reason, we believe that a WTO-WHO joint initiative centered around secretariats who then reach out to members willing to participate could prompt cooperation among countries to make available further trade-related information on PPE supply. To achieve this, we propose a sample WTO-WHO joint initiative that would allow the use of pooled PPE supply data. Under paragraph 3 of this initiative, participating members would amend domestic regulations to support the operation of our proposed system. So manufacturers, distributors, and governments could host or designate a host for the MSTS to operate. However, action may be needed to increase the capacity of some members to undertake systematic monitoring of the state of PPE supply. Clearly, constructing a global PPE market information system will require capacity building and technical assistance for developing countries. In this context, the Trade Facilitation Agreement's flexible implementation approach and its commitment to coordination and cooperation emerges an appropriate starting point that could be improved even further. In this context, the WTO has a vital role in monitoring trade-related information and has recognized the importance of promoting open, transparent, non-discriminatory, and predictable regulatory environments. WTO ministers are actively working to ensure the continuous flow of information needed in global emergencies, and have been joining efforts with the WHO on a number of different issues related to trade and health. In this sense, the WTO and the WHO have a crucial role to play regarding PPE supply data, because the interconnectedness, vulnerabilities of countries facing a pandemic require a coherent, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, and WTO-WHO-wide approach. Accordingly, the information produced by the MSTS should be open to all members to build transparency and preparedness for future crises. In this sense, the MSTS would allow members to make informed policy decisions to 1. Improve preparedness on PPE supply for the next crisis. 2. Contribute to exchanging timely and accurate PPE supply information during a crisis. 3. Promote a coordinated global response on PPE shortages to tackle a crisis more efficiently. 4. Promote coordination among members to finance the expansion of the production capacity of manufacturers of PPE and the companies they source from. And 5. Promote coordination to pool international buying power to prevent hoarding and bidding wars among members during a crisis. Based on countries' responses, the MSTS could be extended to include, for instance, PPE inputs or other essential goods in the future. It is important to stress that this is a pilot initiative to kickstart cooperation and transparency to fight a pandemic. Therefore, we envision that the system could also integrate information related to policies that restrict, promote, diversify, or concentrate the supply of PPE or other essential goods in the future. To achieve this, we anticipate that the system must remain flexible to promote continuous improvement to suit members' needs. Now, My colleague Mariana will present you with some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Nadia. I want to start saying that much has been said about the consequences of COVID-19 and the fact that health takes precedence over the economy. Health comes first and will always come first. We live in a world that has proven to be vulnerable during this health crisis, and we all share responsibility for. The threat of pandemics has increased as our world has become more interconnected. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for increased transparency and information sharing to increase the resilience of global supply chains during crises or emergencies, which ultimately save lives. The handling of the health crisis can be open to criticism due to different policies implemented all over the world. Therefore, we need to be prepared to work together if it's faced with a future crisis. Let me be clear. With this proposal, we want to bring attention to and promote public-private collaboration on PPE supply data. We believe that public-private cooperation on enhancing information transparency will continue to be a critical component on this process, as recognized by the WTO itself, as we begin to prepare for the next pandemic. Innovation is the key to our future world. We need to work together and improve public-private partnerships as governments must effectively engage with firms to adopt an efficient mechanism to share supply data. We need transparency for reaching this goal. Therefore, the solution we propose is the creation of a secure, public, digital system that aggregates real-time PPE supply data for the benefit of all market actors and policymakers, the MSTS. While we hope this proposal will encourage effective collaboration between the public and private sectors, we also acknowledge that motivating governments and firms to cooperate when dealing with common threats to provide a unified response might be challenging. But with a joint work, we will be sure to be ready together to face the next health crisis. Now, we want to extend a thank in advance to Ambassador Anselm for the permanent mission of Sweden to the WTO and Professor Gabriel from the WTO Secretariat for serving as discussants in this session. We look forward to hearing your comments. Additionally, thank you to the moderator, Mr. Rashid Koko from COTS International Geneva, the Geneva Trade Platform, and the Graduate Institute for giving us the opportunity to present at the Geneva Trade Week. Thank you all online for attending. Rashid, we hand the floor back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mariana, Nadia, Kyle, for a very clear presentation. Now let's turn to the discussants. First, I would introduce our first discussant, His Excellency, Mr. Michael Hansen, the Ambassador of Sweden to the WTO since 2018. He is a chair of the Working Party on the accession of Somalia to the WTO. He is a chairman of the steering committee of the Enhanced Integrated Framework, and he has been the chair of the Council for Trade in Goods. So quite an impressive many hats, which make him very suitable for sharing his thoughts on this important point, because he was had worked at the MFS Sweden dealing with WTO before coming to Geneva. So a long and rich experience on trade issues. And I know personally that he's quite active on trade and health issues. So Ambassador, thank you very much for taking the time. You heard our three bright young minds. Where is the problem? And as I love about the young people, they also want to have a solution, not just talk about the problem. So what do you think of that? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Rashid. And first, I will make a small caveat here. If I do have some problems with the line, so if it will be broken, I try to reach on my mobile phone. But Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to address today at Geneva Trade Week and on this very important topic which you raised, ensuring PPE market supply transparency for future pandemics. Lessons to solutions. I really much like it. And I'd like to thank you, Rashid, and CUTS and Graduate Institute and Geneva Trade Platform for this invitation. I think it's a extremely good occasion to discuss these very important topics. But before starting, I first of all would like to commend the authors, Nadia, Kyle, and Mariana, for an excellent contribution, presentation, and extensive work on this very important topic. To start off, I like to take a step back and reflect on the scene setter for the moment, how we actually got to this point where we are. We've been living now with the COVID crisis for more than 1.5 years, and I guess we all, with a retrospect, are quite taken by surprise about the length, the depth, the speed of transmission, the number of contaminations, and the number of deaths the virus has caused. Looking at precaution measures, I'm also struck by the different strategies countries have applied during the first, the second, the third, and the fourth wave. And it is about these differences we must cooperate in the future. And now we are approaching the topic of today's webinar, cooperation. The pandemic had a serious economic repercussion in some sectors more than others. It also led to critical consequences for trade and trade policy. And I think we remember how hard it was to get hold of face masks and toilet paper in early March 2020. What I do like with the author's study and the presentation is something that is very hard to do in economics. It is actually to isolate an event in time and only to study a set of parameters. But in this case, it was possible. And the choice of personal protective equipment, the so-called PPEs, which were critical to stop spreading the virus, is also something we all know and are very familiar with and understand the importance of. Therefore, a very good and very interesting case study that I like to, and I actually read the report, which you others will be able to do soon. If we take a step back in history to the Cold War era, Sweden and other countries had major supplies of all sorts of medical equipment and stockpiled in especially built warehouses in Sweden in granite mountains. We made caves where we could save them. I know this because my mom used to work in overseeing those supplies. But after the Cold War era, this way of doing business, supplying importing goods, was seen as very costly, old-fashioned, and not very efficient. So with the increased globalization, specialization, most of our countries outsourced production and stopped stockpiling everything. PPEs, for example. I think it worked. It works in times when there is no crisis, but COVID has showed us something else. And this is what this study has very good merit pinpointed. The authors also describe this situation as the perfect storm. We all witnessed a to say rational behavior by individuals, local authorities, the state level, where excess purchasing and stockpiling became the new normal. This led to a shortage of PPEs, competition to get hold of what was available. As we heard, surge in price, and as a consequence also the unfortunate imposition of obvious and less obvious trade restrictions. In this unequal race, more countries were ahead of the development. A few countries were ahead of the development, especially the richer ones and those with own production capacities. Poorer countries were as often left behind. With time, as often, market did adjust, but it took a time. Before that, we saw a surge, as we heard, in demand, new suppliers and new markets. But it took a few months to get to the market equilibrium. But in the most critical phase, there were some abnormal market behaviors, or maybe normal behavior to an abnormal market situation. But in such exceptional circumstances, I don't know what rules or agreement would have been respected. So what observations did the authors do from this situation? Well, that there was a high level of volatility due to the lack of accurate, up-to-date, transparent information on the availability of PPEs, which explanation is to be found in the private firms don't need to supply information about their production, their stocks or deliveries. So this is, as you pinpointed, a lack of market information which should be settled. And that led to that policymakers were not aware of the new and also the abnormal market situation. The authors concluded that the lack of transparency about the market situation was probably the one factor that could avoid a similar situation to be repeated. As good students, they looked for other examples and similar situation and find that other examples in the agriculture market information system and in the global pandemic supply chain network. So, as we heard, the author's proposal is to a solution to the situation is to increase transparency about the market situation through a PPE Market Supply Transparency system with private companies which share information about their production, stocks, exports availability, etc. This would guarantee the security of data, which was one missing link during the pandemic, and obtain government to support the private companies to share information about the PPEs. I very much like that the authors come up with a bold proposal to make also a simple a sample of a joint ministerial statement. Just to give an example how this could be implemented. So everything in your proposal, in your study, I think is so far extremely good and something very creative that you come forward with. But where things becomes a little bit more tricky and complicated is when it's getting involved and the relation to the organization to which I am ambassador to, the WTO. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a little bit downbeat sometimes by this organization. It's member states' willingness to be, as we ask for, cooperative, flexible, results-oriented, and try to fix an urgent problem. I agree with authors that this could be a role of the WTO. I also believe, as you describe it, that there is both capacity and knowledge on how it could be done. And also you pinpoint the importance of the cooperation with the WHO. So it's really what we are looking for. But unfortunately, I must say, I don't see it would happen in the short term. So why so? Well, there is already, as you mentioned, the notification requirement within the WTO that we have seen also was not very much respected during this pandemic. This basic information on changes in trade policy in line with the GATT agreement with notification and transparency. But if members can't even supply simple information to already existing framework, how could we then ask them to do more advanced information sharing in new structures, including the private sectors? I don't know, but I would really like to go there. There is also, for the moment, simply too many unresolved issues and initiatives on the table of the WTO to handle and sort out, that my personal opinion is that there is not really an appetite to embark on new tasks and challenges for this organization. Member states tend to disagree on minor things as well as what the Secretariat should do. So even the what question will be an issue for negotiations. Therefore, I guess we have to wait a little bit with this very interesting initiative. But as a solution-oriented, transparent, and WTO reliant Swede, you struck my heart with your paper because it has all the good ingredients. It is well written, it's to the point, it's innovative, it's solution-oriented, and it's bold because you dare to put a sample of a joint ministerial statement in front of us. So congratulations to that. So therefore, would my grade to you on this paper be in the French scale 20 to 20, and I hope very soon that we will be able to get this to the WTO and follow it up when the appetite is there. I stop my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your thoughtful commentary on the paper, and then for your appreciation and this excellent grade and appreciation, which means a lot to the team and to all of us. And I'm also grateful that you very realistically, which should be the case, brought out the formidable roadblocks. You pointed out very rightly what kind of situation we are facing and have faced in the WTO. And I think this is really food for thought for the authors and for us. I would not, and I'm sure you also did not mean that they should not be discouraged, but they should be aware of the challenges and see what to do next. So thank you so much, Ambassador, for that very positive and realistic assessment. My other pointer to the three presenters, I can see that there are 2 questions in Q&A already. I'm sure that you are also looking at that. So since we have limited time, after Gabriel, I will invite all 3 of you again for a couple of minutes each or so, and then you can respond to those questions as well as the comments by the Ambassador and the next discussant. So the next discussant, Professor Gabriel Marceau, who too does not need much introduction. And sorry, thank you for your patience, Gabriel. She is Senior Counselor in the Research Division of the WTO Secretariat since 2020, but her association started with the WTO in 1994. And she has done so many things. I will not go into detail, but I have the privilege of knowing her working in various capacities, including at the time of Doha, which is a very fond memory for me. She is also Associate Professor at the Law Faculty of the University of Geneva and has been visiting professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, the Sorbonne in Paris, Monash University in Melbourne, World Trade Institute in Bern, and many others. So, Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us. I know that you have to leave at 2:55. So, but yeah, sorry for keeping you waiting. And you have now your 8 minutes.
Thank you, Rashid. Thank you to the students who I suppose invited me, to the Graduate Institute, Dimitri and his project. I'm delighted that this paper made it to the Geneva Week, and I was one of the people involved with this first hackathon and was immediately impressed by the quality of the paper and its sort of potential application to WTO reality. I'll make 4 comments. I'll try to be brief to leave time for question. My first comment concerns what is written in your paper at page 18, where with this new mechanism that you borrowed that exists of collective inputting of data that remain confidential and then afterwards can be used, you give 3 options. Remember that the system could be installed in the government preferred sort of institution, option B, installed directly in manufacturer, and option C, on large firm and outsource for the rest. I like very much that you were aware of the sensitivity and that all these options can work and they're not mutually exclusive. The other point that I want to make is about the private sector and the involvement of the private sector and the problems that comes from that. But before I develop this, one question I have again is that you said that the system should be open to all members to help all members build transparency, but you have to be aware that if there can be an impression of unfairness and free riding, because some companies will not input, some governments will not input, and the end result could be sort of modified and not accurate, and to give to all the benefits. I'm not saying it's not a way to do, but I'm saying don't underestimate free riding. My other comment, the ambassador before me alluded to it, is that at the moment there are a lot of proposals. When I read your paper, I was impressed by the link with and the similarity with AMIS, the existing mechanism. And indeed, my expert colleague Majda Peshten here at the WTO was kind enough to discuss with you. And it was a good idea that took place a year ago. Since then, similar or parallel initiatives have been put forward by the International Chamber of Commerce. I think the Swiss have one. The US has a proposal that is not really that. The chairman of the General Council, David Walker, has this big, broad sort of package. So there's a big issue of where to fit that proposal that you put forward. The reason why your proposal is good, it's because, again, it uses a mechanism that has been used in hospital and other areas. My last comment is broader. It's the fact that we realize that to deal with the pandemic, supply chains and all that, we need to involve the private sector. And therefore, this is not new. When I started in 94, 95, a few years after, the Singapore issues were proposed with investment, competition, getting closer to the private sector, and this was rejected. Now that we talk about supply chain, and we have this amazing DG who brought together in the area of vaccine, producers, manufacturers, distributors of vaccine, all these private actors, of course, are necessary. And we need to look at all sorts of regulations other than trade to appreciate. But we have to think, and I don't have any solution. The solution is in your hand, you, the young people, how we can impose obligations on the private sector and on governments, and what are we going to give them in return? And there was 2 days ago, interestingly, in the context of trade facilitation, a proposition by Brazil and US to formalize the engagement with the private sector in trade facilitation. I'm not saying this is the answer for this. My point is we have to think further, because involving the private sector may also entail more change, and we may need to give them a voice or at least think about it. I will simply end in congratulating you for this amazing work. And I worried about COVID and the young people as a teacher, as a professor, but when I see papers like this, I'm confident that you will improve the system. And I want to remain positive about the potential of such a proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. As always, very clear, to the point, balanced, and thought-provoking. And I'm sure that the presenters have taken full note of all the comments, various aspects of there, from the proposal itself to its room and place in the current circumstances at the WTO, and the various challenges and that would one encounter, as well as what could possibly be the way to go around them, like how to involve the private sector on your side. So thank you very much, Prof, for that. Now we have about 10 minutes left. So Nadia, Kyle, and Mariana, there are some of these very useful comments by both Professor Marceau and Ambassador of Sweden, as well as I can see there are now 3 questions. Okay, so I don't want to exercise my right as a moderator, because I'm treating this session as a very different way. So I'm not going to assign these questions to you individually. See, I know you can't communicate too much with yourself right now, but maybe what you can do is that I can prescribe an order in which you can take those questions, so that if one has missed on something, the other can respond to that. And as well, you can also say any from each of your side, any final thoughts that you may have. So do we follow the same order in which the presentations were made, or do we reverse it? I mean, in my other moderation, I normally like to play around with the order. And when after the presentation, when it comes time for question and answer, normally I reverse the order. But how do we go about that? Who would like to go first? And this is one of the challenges also of virtuality in person. So Nadia will start, and then would it be Mariana and Kyle would end? Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, okay. So Nadia, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rashid. In the interest of time, I want to thank both panelists for their insightful comments. And I want to address Professor Gabriel Marceau's comments first, because I know she has to attend another meeting. I want to address the first comment regarding free riders. One of the interesting features of the system that we're proposing is that although we envision this system to be available for all parties, this does not mean that all parties will have the same access. The system can be designed with different levels of access privileges to different users. So for those users that were not cooperating as much as other users, we can limit the kind of information that they could access. So for instance, perhaps they could get a global aggregated output of the PPE, but they wouldn't be able to get more detailed information. So we envision that providing these differences to different users can also incentivize participation further from interested members. Regarding the second issue, there are other proposals out there. We are aware of this. And what we have envisioned is that because this system has the potential to build an international network where each country would have their own system installed and they could be communicating with each other without compromising the security of any of them, because even if one country was compromised by some attack or whatever, the attacker would not have information from any system, because the system operates as a full network. So for anyone to get sensitive information, they will have to attack all countries at the same time that have the system installed. So what we envision is that this system can bring together the different initiatives that countries are proposing at different levels, maybe regional, maybe domestic. So what they could do is just fit the system with this information that they already got thanks to the systems that they are using, and just allow this information to be used more widely, because it would be aggregated at a global scale. So we envision this to be compatible with other initiatives that members are taking. And then regarding the private sector, this is a problem we've been having since the beginning. We know it's a big issue how to engage the private sector. In the paper, we've proposed some incentives. For instance, we propose that governments provide some sort of contingency contracts for parties private parties that commit to sharing their information. So that's one idea. Another idea is perhaps other financial incentives like tax benefits. We have not designed a full toolkit of different incentives that could be proposed to the private sector. The next stage of our project is actually to start reaching out to the private sector to get their feedback on the system, on the proposal, and based on that to further develop this paper to address their needs. So we can think of this as two stages. The first stage, we were thinking of the international level, the international institutions, and once we had a clear idea of what we want to do at that level, then we would move to the next level. So we know it's a challenge. We will work diligently to try to propose a toolkit to incentivize the private sector, and we will reach out to them to refine our proposal. And I think these are the comments that I wanted to make. I now hand the floor to my colleague, Kyle.
Great, thanks, Nadia, and thank you, Ambassador Anzen and Professor Marceau, for your feedback. I've got to be a bit selective of what I want to respond to make sure Mariana's got some material. So the first thing I'd like to respond to is a question posed in the chat that says, under the proposal, a technical solution is being suggested as a possible way to overcome the issue of confidentiality. Did you receive any feedback from the private sector to sound them on their readiness to participate? So I guess this is just an extension of what Nadia has just mentioned. At this stage, what we wanted to focus on in making sure that our proposal was as technically and politically viable as possible, although I assume Ambassador Anzen would disagree with me on the latter. But that, as Nadia said, that's the next stage. So once we've done that and we've gotten feedback from everyone, now it's the chance to go approach the private sector and perhaps, again, kind of develop the toolkit that governments could use to incentivize private sector participation. So that's the next step. And then coming to Ambassador Anzen's feedback about the political difficulties, this is, I guess, the curse of academia, that it sounds all nice in theory, and then as soon as you get to practice, it falls apart. We tried to remain as sensitive to that as possible, but we didn't want to be too much of a downer, and we always thought, if you don't shoot for the moon, you may not actually get anywhere. So there is some point to our ambition. So the reason why we picked PPE and focused it so narrowly on that scope is to try and find something that we hope that members would all have an interest in, and that's politically neutral. As every country in the world needs PPE. PPE is a public good, a global public good, in fact. And so we hope that confining the scope to that could help a bit, at least with its political viability. When it comes to the state of notification obligations in the WTO, which we all know is incredibly poor, we agree that we don't want to impose any kind of additional burden on the state, given the fact that already states are struggling to adhere to current commitments. And so that's why we wanted to make the system as automated as possible. And so there's no, well, depending on which option governments choose, there's less of an additional burden than the traditional way of doing notifications, which is provided by governments. We wanted to try bypass governments, go directly to the private sector, automate their notifications, and therefore reduce the burden that governments have to notify. In addition to that, as Nadia and Professor Marceau mentioned, we did present a number of options, ways in which this proposal could be implemented by the government, directly housing data centers directly in manufacturing plants of large manufacturers, maybe housing it in private institutions such as think tanks or academic institutions in countries, or if a government feels willing, housing it themselves. And so again, we try to see how little obligation and how little of a burden we could place on governments there. So I'll wrap it up there, and I'll leave some of the questions in chat for Mariana to respond to you. But thank you very much for listening to us, and thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I will just answer in 1 minute one of the questions that has been left about the ideas of including disposition of residues. We are going, as Kyle mentioned, we are just focusing in narrowing the PPEs because we want to start as a snowball. So we are trying now to start with a small thing, and then if it's working, we can include also other things, even like for corporate social responsibility, that the one is about residuals, and even vaccines. But we want to start with something that the majority of countries can agree on. That's our main reason of just focusing in PPEs. And I think it's the only one because we already addressed all the questions. So thank you all for this, and we are running out of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia, Mariana, and Kyle for your well-articulated responses. And although it's 3 o'clock, I'm sure Dimitri will allow us 2-3 more minutes for me to conclude. My take on that from the discussions and the questions, very briefly, that yes, people recognize the challenge, that there is a challenge. Also, there is appreciation of the effort made by you regarding proposing the solution. And that was very clearly acknowledged, very positively acknowledged and encouraged, as well as very constructive suggestions to further improve that. And those I would put into 2 categories. One, let's call it the technical side, the other, the political side. The technical, a bit of, okay, how to further tweak, improve, take care of various aspects of this solution. So yes, that's always possible, and one can look into that. But what came out to me as a very strong, strong is not the right word, as a very clearly thing, what I would call the process political issues. How to convince the governments, I'm being blunt, that how to convince the governments in the WTO to do something, given all the things that we are facing there. So, and that is a question, but that also means that one can turn it around to say that, okay, how can one market the idea better in terms of that, okay, what will be the benefits of this for the governments, for the system, as well as for the private sector, so that people can see more clearly the value as opposed to the cost of that. So that would be my take on that. That very positive feedback, very encouraging, and also in a positive sense, what kind of the technical and particularly the political challenges are there, and how best to move forward on that. So in that, let me also say in that sense that in policy work, in the negotiations and the agreements, things do move slowly. As there is a proverb, I don't remember whether Chinese or African, please forgive me for that, that the journey of 1,000 years start with the first step somewhere. So I'm not saying this is a journey of 1,000 years, but it could be a journey of months, if not years, but it has started. Not just first step, but I think several first good steps have been taken by you. And I'm personally very encouraged by the response by Ambassador of Sweden and Professor Marceau. So with that reflections on my part, now all that is left for me to do is to offer formal thanks, of course, to the distinguished discussants, to all three of you, and to all the participants, and particularly those who ask questions as well. And my very special thanks to our partners for the event, the Geneva Trade Platform and the Center for Trade and Economic Integration at the Graduate Institute. And of course, my super special thanks to Dimitri and his team, Michael, and others behind the Geneva Trade Week. With that, I bring this event to a close, but the journey is definitely not over. And I would not be surprised if you hear more from the authors or from us on this issue. And with best wishes to all your journeys, and goodbye for now.
Thank you very much.